To get a sense of the challenges ahead, we need to look no further than the Kurds, the country's largest ethnic minority based in the northeast. For Turkey, Syria's Kurds pose a potential terror threat, and for the US, the Kurds are valuable allies in the fight against the Islamic State group. Well, these diverging views have led to clashes on the ground. In recent days, Turkish-backed rebel forces have fired on US-backed Kurdish forces in northern Syria. With Syria up for grabs right now and Donald Trump about to return to power, things could get even more complicated in the weeks and months ahead. Well, for more on that issue, I'm joined by International Affairs Editor Douglas Herbert.
How are you? I'm here to make it even more complicated.
Let's make it a bit more simple. Okay, so as we've said, the struggle for the control of Syria is playing out, and the country's largest ethnic minority there, the Kurds, are caught in the crossfire. Literally, in recent days, we've seen that Turkish air power fired on US-backed Kurdish forces. Why is Turkey then, a NATO member, taking the fight to the Kurds, which are traditionally a US ally?
Absolutely. And Turkey's a NATO member, too, for the very simple reason, which will become more complicated in a second, that for Turkey, the Kurdish presence in northern Syria is a potential terrorist threat, a threat to Turks' national security. What's interesting, there's an entire region that the Kurds inhabit across this the Mideast region here that we're talking about. There are about 20 to 25 million Kurds, right, around the world. About half of them are based in either southeast Turkey, right on the border with northern Syria, the area we're talking about, also northern Iraq and northwestern Iran. And in, Turkey alone, the Kurds are about 18% of the population. As we know, one of the political offshoots, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as the PKK, based in Turkey, has been sort of waging a war for various types of self-rule against the Turkish state for 40 years, since 1984. Turkey sees this Kurdish presence right on its border, where all the Turks are in southeastern Turkey, as a potential threat to Turkey. They don't want them to all band together. Already this region I was just talking about, right, encompassing Turkey and Iraq and Iran and Syria, it's known among the Kurds as Kurdistan, almost as if it were its own state, because those are where the Kurdish populations tend to be based. For Turkey, its worst nightmare, what gives Erdogan night sweats when he has nightmares, is this prospect of Kurdish groups in northern Syria banding together with what Erdogan sees as a terrorist group, the PKK, in southeast Turkey. I said I was going to make this a little more complicated. Well, you're right. So the SDF, which are the Syrian Democratic Forces, they're an alliance that includes Kurdish forces. The U.S. has been allied with them. The U.S. has backed the Kurdish fighters in the past decade, 13 years of this civil war, in the fight against ISIS. They've been valuable, very effective fighters. Here's where it gets tricky. What we call the Kurdish-backed SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, yeah, it has Kurds in it, but it also is primarily made up of Arabs, Arab fighters, not Kurdish fighters, who Turkey actually hopes will eventually perhaps join the new government, whatever power takes shape in Syria. So it's complicated. The actual group that Erdogan is pointing his fingers at right now in northern Syria is the PYD. It's a party called the Democratic Union Party. They are part of this sort of self-ruling, autonomous sliver of Kurdish interests in northern Syria that they say are hard-linked, hardwired to the PKK, the group that Turkey sees as terrorists in Turkey. I hope I haven't made that too confusing, but it is complicated, but it's complicated for simple reasons. Turkey sees the Kurds as threats. U.S. sees the Kurds as valuable allies. This is going to play out in the months and years ahead, perhaps, as that power vacuum is filled.
And zooming out from the regional dynamics for just a moment, the role of the United States here. Donald Trump, when he was last in the White House, threatened to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria, leaving the Kurds essentially to fend for themselves. But he did change his mind in the end.
He did change his mind. Forceful persuasion from advisors. Look, Donald Trump was adamant. All part of his America First policy was getting out what he saw as an overly large U.S. footprint in the Middle East in what he called the endless wars. That was the sort of benchmark of the hallmark of his foreign policy. The Kurds were a major part of the foreign policy and the U.S. support for those Kurdish interests. Even though there are today fewer than 1,000 American troops, for Donald Trump, it was still too much. You ask what made him change his mind back then. There were big headlines at the time that the U.S. forces, leaving the Kurds in the lurch, high and dry, abandoning them to their fate. He changed his mind because advisors basically said it could have potentially dire consequences in the broader fight against terrorists. Trump always boasted that he was responsible for wiping out ISIS in that entire region and decimating it. So this was part, his advisors said, you pull out the American forces now, that could have a big impact on the U.S. ability to make a difference in fighting terrorists over there. Donald Trump is, if anything, not always ideological. He is often someone spontaneous, transactional, does things on the spur of the moment. He could be open to a lot of different types of policy changes and policy options.
Okay.